All right. So hello, Paco, and we're going to talk now about you and your music a little bit. So what I thought we would do is, kind of moderating this a little bit, is I just have a few questions about his life and his music. I'm thinking that Nate can put some of his music in context of composers in the 20th century, and maybe Jeremy can do a little bit of thinking of how his music connects with Mormon music, Mormon composers, specifically fine art. And then what I thought, I just have like a smattering of questions. And I suspect that you have questions too, and so we'll just do a little question and answer right after that. Does that sound cool? All right, here we go. So I want to talk first about Estudio. So that's the electronic piece that you heard. So in 1977, when that was written, what were you saying about analog things, and how is that different, and how is that created today?
So I wish I could teach you more about the history of analog synthesis right now, but now's not exactly the time, and I'm not the person to do it. But electronic music was still a fairly new thing in the 70s. It's been around for a couple of decades, but the equipment to produce it was still pretty kind of clumsy, I guess, so difficult to use. And so, as I mentioned, Anthony here had put in some time to use a software program called Max MSP to recreate what would have taken large banks of electronic gear and patch cables, sending electronic signal back and forth between these pieces of equipment. All of that was taken care of just in his laptop, and he did it in a weekend with some tweaks. So,
it's really amazing. It was a wacky piece for those of us who are kind of new to that kind of music. But I think about 1977.
And Paco was.
Can you talk about Kraftwerk a little bit? He was in connection with Kraftwerk.
Yeah, the thing that I always want people to know about Paco is that he's the only human being I know who has had family dinner several times with Benjamin Britten and was personally acquainted and performed with the original members of Kraftwerk. It's not, the Venn diagram barely overlaps. Kraftwerk was essentially the first electronic band. They brought electronic music to the stage, to a wider audience, and they still are performing, not with their original members, but their
influence.
Yeah, they influenced everything you've ever heard.
Germany?
What's that?
Germany?
They were a German
Yes,
band?
they were from Dusseldorf, which is how Paco met them. Some of the original members were in orchestras that he was conducting, or were fellow students of his at the conservatory. And they took a little different route than Paco did. But yeah, their music is considered, by bringing electronic music to a popular audience, it essentially influenced every piece of popular music since then, and one could argue even folk music since then.
So tell me, how many compositions are we talking about with his body of work? I know this book that Nate wrote. In the back of it is quite a commitment. He took every known piece and analyzed it. And so there are paragraphs, sometimes a couple of pages, for every known surviving piece. So how many are we talking about? And why don't you describe what we didn't hear? Like, what kind of music is out there that, wasn't represented?
So to answer your first question, there's existing, that we know of, whether or not we have the music. I'll talk about why we don't have some of his music even though he's alive. But there are essentially between 79 and 81 pieces of music that are like major actual works that we know existed at one point. He had some misfortune with his archive over the years, where his home flooded on occasions, and so he lost some electronic tape and some original scores that had not been copied. He had not backed up his electronic storage, and his computer was stolen. Always back up your electronic storage. But he lost a lot of music that way, and it was kind of heartbreaking at certain points. But so basically piecing together his body of work was difficult. It was kind of the most time-consuming part of this project, really.
And tonight's thing is, works that were relatively easy to assemble and small chamber works or solo works. But what else is out there?
Of course, there's orchestral pieces, and especially in his earlier period in Germany, in the early 70s, he was writing intense pieces that required a lot from the performers. There's a piece that I really love and would give an arm and a leg to hear called Kaspar ist tot. And it's based on a poem by a Dadaist named Hans Arp. And it's for like a choir and two soloists. One is speaking, one is singing. One of the singers is supposed to play a guitar, but they don't need to know how to play the guitar. One needs to play a slide flute, and then there's like two organs and an actual guitarist and like I can't remember exactly right now, but there's like 4 or 5 other random instruments, and it's this beautiful, beautiful handwritten score.
Tell us about the scores look like, because if you haven't seen them.
Oh my goodness, that's the thing that really
wow.
That really lit me up when I was looking through his music. That like I'd at first seen a lot of some of his very few published works, and they're engaging and wonderful. I played the Juego C for you earlier. That's one of his few published. But others that I'd seen early on were reproduced in Finale, and it's a computer notation software, and so they just look kind of normal. But his handwritten work when he was working in Germany. It's absolutely stunning. His penmanship is meticulous and clean, and he's written these long, painstaking scores.
Big, oversized works, right?
Yeah, large pieces of paper for orchestra. And I know that to some of my composition professors that are here and other composers, like it's nothing. But to me, it's very inspiring to see the monastic dedication that went into some of these pieces.
So then there are choral works too.
There are no actual like choral works as we think of choral works in a normal concert setting. But for example, as I mentioned in Kaspar ist tot, there's a chorus, and it's I would describe it as in the style of Ligeti a little bit. It's very ethereal, very dissonant, and somewhat indeterminate in their pitch and their form.
Isn't there oratorio though?
There is a recently composed work of his, which is the one I'm possibly most excited about, although I just said that about Kaspar ist tot. It's called El Sueño de Lei, The Dream of Lehi, which is a large-scale work for orchestra and chorus with 4 soloists, outlining several chapters from the Book of Nephi, with insertions of Latin liturgical texts and his own basic commentary on the scripture. It's in need of some editing at this point before it could be performable, but it's a beautiful, beautiful work, and it's just large scale. I'm excited to someday have it done.
Some people wrote to me after this book came out, and they said, I play the guitar. Is there any guitar music? I said, he's Spanish. What is there for guitar?
So he has 4 or 5 pieces for guitar, at least one of which the score is no longer in existence, and unfortunately that's the one for flamenco guitar. Would have been really nice. But I had asked him at one point, most composers don't write even that much or that much of a percentage of their works for guitar, because guitar is really hard to write for, unless you're a guitarist. And I had asked him, is that because you're Spanish? Is that a Spanish strain? And he said, no, not really. It's mostly just because I happened to be around really great guitarists. I think part of that is because he was in Spain. But a lot of his works were also written when he was in Germany. So he just had the luck to be around great guitarists.
So as we were listening to the program, you probably felt this way too, there's quite a difference between 1970 and 2015 works. How would you say his compositions have changed over time?
Yeah, it's very interesting to see there's a distinct change, for better or for worse, right about the year 2000. In the year 2000, I know of only 2 works that he wrote in that year, and one is for electronic tape and tubular bells. So a performer is playing the tubular bells, and there's a tape track that accompanies it, and it's really wild and kind of weird, and it's titled El Preludio a la Memoria del Ángel Moroni, Prelude to the Memory of the Angel Moroni. And, so it's Mormon music, but anyone listening to it would be like, there's nothing inherently Mormon about it except it was written by a Mormon. I think there's something wonderful about that. But the other work written during that year, he titled Mi Oración, My Prayer, and it's basically a reworking of, I'm blanking on the composer's name. I told you about this just the other day. So there's the Bach prelude, and then the Ave Maria over the Bach prelude. Gudo.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pam.
Shame on me. But so it's a reworking of that reworking. So he's written his own melody over the Bach prelude and then transposed it a little bit. And he wrote this little text that it's a very Mormon prayer. It's a very interesting thing. But stylistically, it's the other end of the spectrum. And the reason for that is he began using finale that year. He stopped writing his works by hand. And the medium changed, and so his message changed. His music has a lot of the same processes, a lot of the same impetus and the same creative devices, I suppose. But it feels very different, actually. And it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. His output has actually increased since that time, but the music's very different.
I mean, I'm not going to assume that you're all Mormon, but we are in, Provo, so I'm sure you have some connection with Mormonism, so let's talk a little bit about that. So, fine art music by Mormons. I mean, you've had a chance to look at some of these scores, right?
Yeah.
So, by the way, just so you know, there are two organizations in Utah that have acquired the full archive of his surviving music. The Church Museum in Salt Lake has it, and also BYU Special Collections at the Harold Beatty Library. And those will be open for anyone to study and perform those works. So just throw that out there. But so you have memorized things. But could you talk about how he fits in with what you know about fine art, Mormon?
Well, I think the thing that strikes me is how it doesn't fit in really. Because, when you look at the history of art music in the church, in the late 19th into the early 20th century, it's sort of dominated by this cluster of composers, many of them connected with the New England Conservatory. They'd been sent back to the New England Conservatory. Many of them came back to Utah. So you have this string of composers: Evan Stevens, Cecil Gates, Arthur Shepard, Theodore Robertson, Crawford Gates, Mel Bradshaw, and there's this sort of string of pupils and students, and they're connected, and they all have kind of connections to the Mormon corridor, and then in the later 20th century and into the 21st, there's this kind of wild diversity of styles, and Mike Hicks has written a little bit about this, a lot about this, where, about this thing in particular, where a sort of not having a style becomes kind of a style. And Mike has spoken a little bit about what's Mormon about that. But the thing that strikes me as exciting and engaging about that kind of stylistic fluidity and eclecticism, which is I think pretty well represented in this program and pretty well represented in the book and in his entire work, is that when a composer is conversant and convincing across different styles and through different musical languages, it suggests that there's something to say, that he has something to say that transcends the style or the language or the technique, and it has something profound to say that sort of emerges in this sort of mysterious way from all of that. And that, to me, kind of speaks to me that triangulates with something more cosmic than cultural. And I think that's also what makes it exciting to discover for you guys to have discovered this composer that was totally off the Mormon radar, that speaks from a place of sort of religious mystery and spirituality in a way that we can relate to, but totally disconnected from that sort of provincial history of Mormon composers in the West, because that also triangulates with something more cosmic about Mormonism than something just provincial and cultural.
Rockwell told me he had never heard of Merrill Bradshaw, for example.
Right. And that makes sense. And there are a few other composers that American composers and a handful that you've done some diligent work discovering and chronicling that aren't connected to that, and so I think that's really valuable to hear familiar ideas in a totally different voice.
I mean, did you ever get the impression that he felt frustrated that here's this guy, like, he works in the temple every week, he's a bishopric member, he sacrificed a great deal in his life for the church, that the church has no idea who he is at all? Did you ever get that sense?
Not at all, because that's kind of the antithesis of Paco. He's like the most humble person I've ever known. He's never, like, he's totally surprised that this is happening.
The least entitled person I've ever met.
Yeah, he had no presumption of fame or even, he wrote his music almost into a vacuum, and so he's felt no ill will that he deserves something from the Mormon community, and I think part of that is because he's so separated from it. He is a convert to the church, and he has his church community, and that's somehow completely interlaced with his musical identity, but there's no conflict for him. There's no need for recognition from Mormonism at large.
How did you join the church?
So the missionaries found him. Plain and simple, the missionaries found him. He'd recently underwent a divorce and had a young son, and it was a rough time for him. He'd been contemplating a lot of things. He'd been attending some churches. It's a very familiar story. And then the missionaries apparently one day, their last day in the area, it's straight out of the ensign. They had pointed at the map and said, "We're going to knock that street." And they went to the top of the apartment building, and they knocked the first several doors, and then they were about to get in the go down the stairs, and then the elevator opened, and Paco and his son came out, and they said, "Hey, would you like to talk?" And the rest is history. It's the most, almost, mundanely miraculous.
And there was this Messianic connection as well with.
Certainly, so he had some brief periods of study with Olivier Messiaen, one of the great masters of the 20th century, and he was, by all accounts, a spiritual giant, and in Paco's own words, was the most spiritual man he's ever met. Had a transcendence about him, and that he credits with a bit of the impetus for his searching for a deeper meaning and for religious meaning. He'd been brought up sort of passively Catholic, and he was looking for something more. But I find it really interesting that Messiaen is really his door to the church.
What year was that conversion made?
He was baptized in 1983, but he'd been investigating for a couple of years, as I understand.
So this is a thornier question, and because you're not employed by the church in any way. so the church membership is 20% Spanish speaking. As far as I know, at least the last time I looked at the Spanish speaking hymn book, there were no original hymns written by Spanish composers.
Mexican national anthem in the back.
Mi querido Santa Claus was when I was there. But what does it mean? What does it mean to have a composer of this quality in the church? Is there potential? Am I just reaching? I can't imagine this is an insignificant occurrence.
No, I think it remains to be seen what that might mean for Spanish-speaking members of the church. But I mean, it's still art music that is going to have a smaller audience than pop music.
And it's
or
the way it's used certainly will be
right.
different.
But I mean, I think for certain communities, it could in the Spanish-speaking world, it could be a really big deal. But to me, it symbolizes something bigger about this, a sort of shift of cultural center of gravity. I mean, I think as more and more of Mormonism is outside of the U.S. and Canada, and more of Mormonism is outside of the English-speaking world, that cultural shift of gravity is a really big deal. And I mean, that to me kind of points towards a future Mormonism that culturally is very different and a lot more that doesn't always take its cultural cues from here.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Okay, before I open up to questions, I have a question for performers. So, Jenny, you're one of a few are still around here. What did you think when you got this score and you kind of waded through it? I assume you had never heard of him, right?
No.
So, what were your impressions as you kind of worked your way through this music?
I love his writing for voice, and he hasn't written very much, from what I understand. So, I would hope he would write.
I think he needs to hear
a
this
lot
recording.
more.
Here's what he needs to do.
Yeah. I want you to write a lot more vocal music. No, because it's beautifully written, and I think the emotion. When we had that Skype interview, we were talking about it. I was able to pick up on so much of the emotion just from the writing, like a lot of what he was then speaking of. You're able to sense that just from the nature of it, and I think from a LDS perspective, even though it's it's not church like words.
Right.
You know what I mean? But there's a spirit I feel about it that transcends, like a goodness, a message, like you're saying, a transcendent message that I think is really that people can feel, and so to know that is by someone who's LDS, I think that opens up a lot of venues for.
Yeah. I mean, I was noticing, listening to you, and maybe you have, a clearer picture of than I do, that there's this integrity to him. And quite a lot of his work's political. The whole thing, your piece has a lot to do with Lorca's assassination as a young writer, and he's been very active. There's a piece for piano quintet after the Madrid bombings in 2004 that's just visceral. It's like spectacular music. So he's political in a way that fewer Mormon composers in the listing of the historical ones. But do you have any idea about comment about that?
I think honesty is a quality that you've hit it right on the head. That all of his music, even the stuff that I don't, maybe it's not the top quality. Some of it is top quality. Others, everything doesn't have to be, but everything that he's written is absolutely honest. He has an integrity about his writing, and he says what he means to say. Like you said, I don't think there's anything political in a certain sense about a lot of his work, but he does not back off from saying what he wants to say in his music. There's no, like I said, there's no conflict between his daily life and his artistic.
There's a deep engagement with Spanish intellectual writers,
Sure.
and also other writers, as you saw. So, Anthony, you weren't even born when the piece that you helped recreate was coded. So, what was that like for you, seeing that original score? What was your impression of him?
I mean, that was actually my first graphical score interpretation. I mean, I've seen a lot of different graphical scores around, especially in electronic music. And once we hit time when we were rehearsing the piece and actually trying to interpret it and carry out what he had written, there was so much more. There was a lot more depth than just kind of reading it. It was interesting taking a step back, and maybe it was just that we were focusing on one specific part instead of me just typing away what I needed to do and seeing it, in a bigger picture. But really, he gave a lot of thought into each little parameter and each line that was going on throughout the piece. And I think it's hard, especially at that time when you can't just go in and get 6 people in a day and go and write everything out. There's a finesse to that, I think, especially with primitive equipment.
He wrote a book called Acustica Musicale, which is, acoustic music. It is so filled with math, I can't even tell you. It's really impenetrable.
It's a textbook, basically. He's taught acoustics at collegiate levels, and the book's thorny. It's very thorny.
Get working on the translation.
Too much calculus involved. Yeah.
All right, so you might have some ideas. Questions. So, if you do, you might not, but you do.
I was interested in Nathan's translation for the verbal choral piece. My word, in translate, the syllables don't always work out. And there was really a lot of words. How to make that happen?
Well, I'll admit that there was some composition on my own part involved, but I tried to remain true to the. He had composed a form basically, and he had composed a manner of delivering each text at certain times, and there's kind of a counterpoint to it. So sometimes all 4 voices are speaking together, and sometimes one voice is quieter, or sometimes a voice is all by itself.
And each block is like 4 seconds or something?
Yeah, he wrote it out in a grid, so each box.
It seemed very rhythmic, like you had it like a contrapuntal thing that you had to do rhythmically perfect.
Yeah, it was kind of amazing how easily all that came together. But yeah, each grid box is supposed to equal 4 seconds, and then he has specific notations. He has a whole page of notes on what his little diagrams mean. So I just reproduced that all in English, and I didn't have to do. I did a little bit of the translation. Honestly, most of it I found in the original poems that had come from Hess or Rilke, and found the English versions of those. He'd used the Spanish versions. I couldn't find the writings of Rudolf Ferretti that he'd used, so I translated that myself. And some of the Hess texts were actually only available in German and Spanish, not in English, so I translated those myself.
And also the timbre. It was written for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass.
That's right.
But your vocal timbre, your spoken voices wouldn't necessarily be the same as if you were singing pitches. But
right.
Still, you tried to be a tenor, and somebody tried to be bass.
Yeah, and he marks throughout it. Sometimes it's supposed to be sung in a very high register, and sometimes it's a low register. Other times he marks that you may choose whichever register you wish, or just a normal register. Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating piece, and it was written when he was relatively young as well.
Did you say during the performance that was one of his very first?
That was the earliest piece on the concert, the most early written. He would have been 25 when it was written. It was in 1970. But that was written when he was still living in Spain. It was the year that he moved to Germany. So I consider that his last Spanish piece, though he doesn't remember whether it was written in Spain or Germany.
In your book, you have works as early as 1964.
64 is the first piece that he doesn't have the handwritten score anymore, but he at some point reproduced it digitally, and so we have that. But that's the first. He would have been 19, and so that's the first piece that we have that he claims is. I'm sure he wrote things before that, but he doesn't accept them as his works.
I have a related question to what she was asking as well. In addition to all the music you just performed, which was incredibly impressive, his poems in Spanish are phenomenal.
Yes.
And it kind of nails Lorca's style. I was just wondering if you talk about him as a poet or as a librettist, or if there are other things that he wrote for publication. Or
You thought that Lorca wrote those until 2 days ago.
Well,
I'm
not surprising.
the
They sound
complete
so
works of
nice.
Lorca. Never found them.
Yeah.
What's going on here? But he had written other wonderful poems, and some of his others, I can point one out to you later that's reproduced in the book. But
There's quite a lot of text. I mean,
he uses a lot of text.
Even like what's that one where letters of poems indicate notes, but they're not sung?
Yeah, that's probably the earliest piece that used his own poetry. It's called Variaciones Comiques. He wrote it when he was living in Italy, actually, in 71. It's for piano. But he essentially took these two poems. He wrote a poem about love and a poem about hate. And in the first variation, or the theme, the poem about love is in the right hand and the poem about hate is in the left hand. And each letter of the poem corresponds, I'd mentioned like a decoder ring chord, like the letter A corresponds to a B flat, and then the letter B corresponds to a B natural. And then that's mapped out over 26 notes and then 26 notes again. So each hand basically has the alphabet. And he skips D sharp in one octave. I've never been quite certain.
But the rhythms have to be crazy because they don't align.
He takes the text, and so the first word might be L in one hand, and so you just do E-L. But within that same rhythm, the left hand might be doing El amor es, a phrase of 12, 13 letters or a couple words together. And so you're supposed to play a ratio of 2 against 13 or whatever. And sometimes, he's got like 23 against 45, things like that. And so I made a MIDI reproduction of it, which is really fun to listen to. But I've never been quite certain if he meant it to be played or not. It's kind of a conceptual thing that he used these poems to produce this very heady kind of conceptual music that's not.
So
really
is that like the Dada connection? Because there's a bunch of Dada works, right?
He kind of fell in love with Dada in his younger days. He wrote a piece that he won a really impressive prize from UNESCO, Homenaje a Marcel Duchamp. So he really loved Duchamp. He'd used, as I mentioned, this poem by Hans Arp.
And the Duchamps for guitar and flute.
And it's essentially nothing but extended techniques. He wrote to me about his love for Dadaism and the beauty of finding meaning in meaningless things and in the mundane. And I loved that take on that absurdity can be imbued with meaning. There's something a little existentialist about it, but he loved Dada.
How was his work received in New York?
The only review I ever found of it was a listing in Spain. Very, very little about it.
So he was a prize winner of big awards. Is that correct?
Yes, major awards from Germany, Spain, the Netherlands, Greece. Especially the fund all over.
Cool. Anybody else?
How did you find him?
I was hoping that question would come.
Because you just find these people. Tell us the story.
Well, the short answer, which sounds kind of snarky, is I'm looking. But Miro Bradshaw, I think it was 1986, 1995, something like this.
It was in the 90s.
1995 or 96. He gave a talk, and it was about Mormon composers, and he just put a listing of all those who were active. I mean, not active as in Mormon, but actively composing. Mm-hmm. And there was just a single listing for Francisco Estévez, Spain, actively composing. That's all. I asked some people, and they had no idea what this was about it. I don't know. And so I live in New York, and the public library is close to me. So I spent some time there, and they had a couple of scores. They had Huegos, and they had the Duchamp pieces that were both commercially published. And so I was there at they had this reading room in the special collections, and you request a score, and it arrives, and then they just have a little keyboard like that. And I had headphones, and I played through maybe 3 lines of Huegos, the one that you played, and I thought, oh, this is a guy. This is somebody. I mean, it just felt like there was the mind behind it was, more than I could explain. And so I really tried hard to find him, and it was really difficult. So the rest of the story is quite extended, and you tell it beautifully in this book. But basically, we found this guy, I found this guy in this chat room, Spanish contemporary music chat room, and he found a host, maybe 9 or 10 recordings. In Spain, there's a lot of state music, so orchestras are subsidized by radio stations by the state, and they play a lot of new music. And he had apparently just recorded those off the air. So I gathered quite a good group of works, and it turned out ultimately that they were works that he didn't have, that Paco hadn't heard before, so and hadn't heard in some cases in decades. So then, after I found that, that was encouraging, and there's an LDS group that performs these, it's like this music festival. In Europe, they travel from different cities. It's like Barcelona one year, and then Rome one year, and it's extraordinary. It's for children all the way up to adults, and their master classes and their things for children. It's just an extraordinary organization. You remember the name of it?
I don't.
It's just extraordinary.
Glen Gordon knows about
Yeah,
that.
and they have postings on YouTube, and I noticed them. One was in the Sagrada Familia at Barcelona, and they did this piece of Paco's that I just thought was amazingly beautiful. It's not, an earth-shatteringly modern piece. It was really, really beautiful. So then by looking at those listings on YouTube, they were posted by various people, and then I went on Facebook and stalked them and reached out to them, and one thing led to another, and as you can guess, Paco is not, online a lot. So that took a fair amount of work. So after we had made contact, then this lovely guy came into my life through this lovely guy who sent him to me when he was visiting New York once, and I knew that his Spanish was lovely, and so I just sent him to Spain. And we didn't know if he would even open the door.
Really?
We didn't know. He just went.
I had been trying to communicate with him by email. I had reached out to try to Skype him, but he didn't have the technological know-how to make Skype happen, and so I had never really fully communicated with him.
Didn't he say if you're in town, come to our ward. It means
churches at 9.
I said it all the time.
That's all he had, and so he just went.
Showed up to church.
and then, of course, the rest, was super embracing and lovely. And the original goal was to just chronicle the archive, just see what's there, what's hiding under the bed, what's in the closets. And a lot of works have been lost. Some, fortunately, I have recordings for that have been lost, so that's a little bit cool. But that was, a few days. How long were you in Spain? 5 days. Then he came back, and then that's when the real work began, and lots of communications back and forth, and various ups and downs of frequency and so forth. And then it seemed to me that was a kind of an interesting story, and so I said, well, maybe there's a book here. And then he finished writing a book, which is quite lovely, And when he was completely done, I said, why don't you make this appendix that's like 100 pages and just give everybody as much information as you can? Because with these things, who knows if anybody's ever going to really continue following up. There's these little windows that composers in the church have of opportunity. And my feeling is, if we're all there at the same time, reach through, grab it. So that's the long and short of it, really.
One of my favorite things about that, though, is that so we found out one reference from Merrill Bradshaw, and he had since passed away. So we couldn't ask him how he found out about Paco.
Barlow.
No, we thought
I
that.
There's no. I've looked
He'd
through the
never
Barlow
applied.
records. He had never heard of the Barlow endowment. He'd never heard of Merrill Bradshaw. He still has no idea.
Is it maybe his memory you're thinking?
Hmm.
You're thinking that maybe he's just forgotten?
Yeah.
Well, no, but the Barlow endowment, they will ask, at least at that time with Merrill, they'd be polling around
I
who do
see.
you know. So a person might not have applied. I mean, I never applied. I've been on their list, for 30 years. But so I think he just sort of ferreted it out, the name at least, maybe not knowing anything more than that.
Yeah.
Well, I just had a question, Jude.
Yeah.
So has he led you to other LDS composers in
Led me.
his circle? And,
Sure.
yeah,
There's an enormous number of people in Europe
that he's
that are
yeah.
that are doing that kind of stuff that he's doing.
Yeah.
Wow.
We just, I mean, it gets tricky. Why don't we know these people? There are reasons why. I'm not exactly sure if I have the answers to all the reasons why. But, there's not really a canon, let's say, of fine art music, would you say? As there is a canon of hymns, but there's an A-list. And who decides who those people are? And some of it is just exposure. So our goal is that, with some events like this and some that seem to be forming in the near future, that additional people will have access to him and vice versa. And since he's so active right now in composing, I mean, this is a new...
He's a good shot in the art for him.
This
He's
is a new
71
thing
years
for
old
him.
and he's finally getting some recognition.
Yeah. I can't tell you the experience of calling him. I mean, I will remember it forever. He was just so excited.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Anybody else?
So their careers.
Does he record his own music ever?
Hardly at all.
Okay.
He's managed to, he's had a couple commissions in the last decade, and those have been recorded. Or, for example, the piece for the Mormon music EFY thing in the Cathedral of the Sagrada Familia. So there's some happenstance recordings, essentially, but he hasn't really made much effort to go out and record his own music.
Other composers in Spain who are LDS are championing him because they look at him as sort of a father figure. And so whenever there's an opportunity to capture some music, and they're slightly more savvy of social media and sharing audio, then they're the ones who seem to be putting him forth. But in the last maybe month or so, he's posted a number of works on YouTube, for example. And I assume that tonight's concert is going to be, YouTubeable. So that'll be nice for him. Anybody else? Anybody have a question? Fantastical. Thanks so much, everybody.